Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from group 6. Today we will explain about class 2. And before we start the presentation, it will be better to introduce our group members. The first, Titik Syahida, Mochammad, Fariz, Hisyam, Lia Ainun Nisa, and Jihanasia, Bornin, Javati. Okay, the first presenter will be explained by me, Lia Ainun Nisa. Main and subordinate clause. Clause is a series of words that contain meaning. The clause is divided into two, namely main clause and subordinate clause. Main clause is a clause that can stand alone into a sentence. This clause has a subject plus verb pattern in its simple form. This clause is also known as the independent clause. For example, Syahida was sleeping. Subordinate clause. Subordinate clause is a clause that can stand alone into a sentence. This clause has a complementizer plus subject plus verb pattern in its simple form. This clause is also known as the dependent clause. For example, when Lia cooked for dinner. If the two clauses above are combined, it will create a perfect series of sentences. Syahida was sleeping when Lia cooked for dinner. The relationship between main clause and subordinate clause were explained in the discussion of practice rules at the end of the clause 1 chapter. There, we saw that when a complementizer is removed from an adverbial clause or a complement clause, it leaves a sequence of words which make up a complete main clause. The removal of the complementizer from relative clause can leave a sequence that like either the noun phrase, which will be to the left of the verb, or the noun phrase, which will be to the right of the verb. And notebook. Complementizer is a word that used to introduce an adverbial clause or a complement clause. It is including subordinate conjunction as, because, since, etc. Relative pronouns who, whom, which, whose, that, and relative adverb when, where, why. One way of handling the relationship is assume that the route from main clause to relative clause is as follows. The cottage which Fariz achieved was very small. Assumes that the source of the relative clause which Fariz achieved is Fariz achieved which, with the pronoun which in the usual slot for direct object. The pronoun which is moved to the front of the clause, in fact to a special slot for complementizer outside the main body of the clause. This enables us to show that which is the direct object of achieved as and which is the complementizer of the relative clause.
Okay, for the next is clause and sentences. Clause is an important unit of analysis because many head modifier relations are found within the clause, and the criteria for constituent structure apply the best inside the clause. Sentence is not very useful in this respect, which is only a few dependency relation cross clause boundaries, and the constituent structure criteria do not really apply outside single clause. Consider this example. Nasya has discovered where Malika stay. First, the example contains main clause Nasya has discovered where Malika stay. Second, the object of discover where Malika stay is itself of a clause. Third, this complement clause is said to be embedded in the main clause, and it is controlled by discover. Fourth, it uses complementizer where. It is generally accepted that we can specify where words occur in phrases, and when phrases occur in clauses, but not where entire sentences occur in a text. Okay, for the next is verb complement clauses. Substitute for either noun phrase with a transitive verb. For example, A. Anne astonished her father. B. That Captain Wentworth married Anne astonished her father. C. Sir Walter Elliot imagined the scene. D. Sir Walter Elliot imagined that he was still handsome. First, Anne in A is replaced in B by the complement clause that Captain Wentworth married Anne. Second, the scene in C is replaced in D by the complement clause that he was still handsome. The complement clauses can be analyzed as occupying noun phrase slots. Time adverbs such as yesterday occur at the beginning of a clause or at the end of the verb phrase. As in 1, an adverbial clause of time typically occur in the same position as in 2. 1a. Yesterday, Lydia eloped with Wickham. B. Lydia eloped with Wickham yesterday. 2a. When Lydia went to Brighton, she eloped with Wickham. B. Lydia eloped with Wickham when she went to Brighton. Adverbial clauses of reason occur in a similar position. Both can precede or follow the main clause and both are optional. 1a. Because of the strike, the commuter traveled by army lorry. B. The commuter traveled by army lorry because of the strike. 2a. Because the bus driver were on strike, the commuter traveled by army lorry. B. The commuter traveled by army lorry because the bus driver were on strike. Clauses of concession and condition can also be seen as parallel to phrases. Example 1 can be replaced as 2. The phrase in spite of is not obviously a concession phrase. 1. Although Mr. Darcy disliked Mrs. Bennet, he married Elizabeth. 2. In spite of his dislike of Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Darcy married Elizabeth. Example 3 can be replaced and split into two sentences, as in 4. If Emma had left Hartfield, Mr. Woodhouse would have been unhappy. 4. Emma might have left Hartfield. In that case, Mr. Woodhouse would have been very unhappy. Okay, for the next is conclusion. 1. Sentence has a certain sort of unity, being grammatical complete and has a degree of semantic independence which enable it to stand on its own independent of context. 2. Clauses are recognizable in all types of spoken and written language, but that no reliable criteria exists for the recognition of sentences and in spontaneous speech.
Okay, I will continue the explanation. The material is more properties of subordinate clause. The subordinate clause in a given sentence are to a large extent grammatically independent of the main clause. They can stand on their own in writing at any rate, but the main clause does not control the choice of verbs and other constituents, nor the choice of participle roles, tenses, aspect, and modal verbs. Is compare the variant of complement clauses below. There are three examples. The first example is we heard that Captain Benwick would marry Louisa Heather, that Mary Heather was a hypochondriac. Two complement clauses are active, and the last that Admiral Cove was always accompanied by his wife. Is copula construction and passive. The second example, we hear that Captain Benwick has married Louisa Heather. Has married in this is perfect verb. Then that Captain Benwick married Louisa Heather is simple past tense in word married. The third is that Captain Benwick is marrying Is marrying is present tense verb, and the fourth is that Captain Benwick will marry Lia Ainun. Will marry in this sentence is future tense. And the third example, we hear that Captain Benwick must have married Lia Ainun. The complement clauses have different modal verb, which is might marry and must have married. Subordinate clauses are subject to a number of constraints that do not apply to main clause. For instance, declarative, interrogative, and imperative. Look the example in 3.1. A. Captain Wentworth wrote a letter to Annie Elliot is the example of declarative. In B, did Captain Wentworth write a letter to Annie Elliot is example of interrogative. In C, write a letter to Annie Elliot is example of imperative. And then, subordinate clauses are not free with respect to choice of declarative, interrogative, and imperative. For example, relative clauses, adverbial clauses, and most types of complement clause must have declarative syntax. Look example in 3.2. A. Because did Marian love P, she refused to believe that P had deserted her because Marian loved P. In B, if did Emma leave Hartfield, Mr. Woodhouse would be unhappy if Emma left Hartfield. Phrase most type of complement clause was used because a number of verbs allow a type of complement that is traditionally called indirect questions. Look at example 3.3. A. Elizabeth asked whether if Mr. Brinley would return to Netherfield. In B, the girls wondered who Mr. Bell had recited in his library. Then, contemporary spoken English has the type of complement clause in example 3.3. It is normal for spoken English in all sorts of formal and informal contexts, and is beginning to turn up in the written text. Example 3.4. In A, she asked was Alison coming to the party. In B, we were wondering who did you meet at the conference. The complement clauses have straightforward interrogative syntax. Note that although the complement clauses in 3.4 have interrogative syntax, they do not invalidate the statement that subordinate clauses are typically limited to declarative syntax. Subordinate clauses are limited in the other respect. Main clauses, but not subordinate clauses, are open to a wide range of synthetic construction. 1. Prepositional phrase fronting. There are 5 examples. In A, in came Norris or on Norris came in. Into the room came on Norris. B. She said that in came on Norris. She said that into the room came on Norris. C. The person who in came at the moment was on Norris. The person who into the room came at that moment was on Norris. D. Because in came on Norris, Fanny stopped talking. Because into the room came on Norris, Fanny stopped talking. And the last example, when it came on Norris, Fanny stopped talking. When into the room came on Norris, Fanny stopped talking. So the construction has a preposition in first position followed by the main verb, followed by subject noun phrase. Compare example B. It can occur in declarative main clauses and in complement clauses, but not in relative clauses or adverbial clauses. 2 is a negative fronting. There are 5 examples too. A. Never had Sir Thomas been so offended. Sir Thomas had never been so offended. B. They realized that never had Sir Thomas been so offended. C. The person who never had he been so offended was Sir Thomas. D. Because never had Sir Thomas been so offended, even Mr. Yaris left. And last, when never had Sir Thomas been so offended, Mr. Yaris left. And example B can be diverted from Sir Thomas had never been so offended. Never moves to the front of the clause and Sir Thomas and had changed place. As with preposition fronting, the construction is adjectival in main clause and complement clause, but not in relative or adverbial clauses. As is the questions, there are 5 examples too. A. Dr. Granley habitually ate too much rich food, didn't he? B. We realized that Dr. Granley died because he ate too much rich food, didn't he? C. The person who ate too much rich food, didn't he, was Dr. Granley. D. Because Dr. Granley ate too much rich food, didn't he? He died of apoplexy. And the last, when Dr. Granley died of apoplexy, didn't he? Mary Crawford want to live with his wife. Didn't he in example A is a tag question, so named because the structure consists of a declarative clause. Dr. Granley habitually ate too much rich food, with a question tag on the end, didn't he? The question consists of verb did, might, can, etc. as a pronoun and possibly with the negotiation maker.
Okay, for the next material, we will talk about finite and non-finite clause. For the first one, I will explain to you guys about finite clause. Finite clause is a main clause or a subordinate clause that must have a verb to show the tense. The verb can be in the present tense or past tense. The tense can be changed from the present tense to the past tense or from past tense to the present tense. It is because the verb in the present tense or past tense is called finite verb. The clause that contains a finite verb is called a finite clause. For example, the fishermen are mending their nets. Then, we dined at a cheap restaurant last night. And we were not allowed in because we arrived late. Next is non-finite clause. Non-finite clause is a subordinate clause that is based on an infinitive or a participle. It contains a verb that doesn't show the tense, which means it doesn't show the time at which something happened. There are 3 types of non-finite clauses. The first one is infinitive phrase. In this type, the verb comes after the word to. For example, he gave up his job to travel the world. We wanted to ask her to come along. And then, the person to make the report at the police station was the sergeant. Then, a subordinate conjunction is often used to begin a non-finite clause. The subordinate conjunctions that used here are if, unless, and though. For example, her appointment, if approved, will make her the company's first female general manager. And then, the police, unless notified, will not carry out an investigation. The rescuers found the boy, though injured, fully conscious. The non-finite construction to allow some modality to be signaled, that is, events that can be presented as necessary or requiring permission or requiring ability. As in this example, Fanny regretted having to talk to Aunt Norris. This sentence is necessity. And then, Julia and Maria wanted to be allowed to perform a play. This sentence is permission. And then the last one, Edmund wanted Fanny to be able to ride a horse. Then, the sentence is ability. And then the second type of non-finite clause is gerund phrase. In this type, the verb ending in "ing" is used. For example, I had traveling to Glasgow by the M8 at this time of the year. And then, Fanny regretted talking to Mary. Then, Sheila quickly hiding something under the chair when I came in. I assumed that she had been buying my Christmas present. Then, the third type of non-finite clause is free participle phrase. In this type, it contains adjunct with any forms of verb. Usually, it contains ing form verbs. For example, knowing the country well, he took a shortcut. Slamming the door, he ran down the steps. His car sold. He set off on foot for Kendal. Well, maybe that's all for our presentation in this video. I apologize if there are any mistakes when we explaining the material to you guys. I hope you guys enjoying the material that presented here. Yep. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Happy holiday, guys. See you in the next semester.